You were never supposed to hear this. Not from me, not from anyone. What I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that was meant to stay buried, dissolved into silence like wet paper, erased from maps, whispered only when the doors were locked and the candles were out. And yet here we are. You've pressed play. Your ears are open, and now the question is not whether you believe. It's whether you'll survive knowing. Because once you hear it, once the shape of the Bellwether family begins to take form in your mind, you won't ever look at your own reflection the same way. You won't ever trust your shadow either. In fact, if you're listening right now in a dim room, if the lamp beside you flickers, if the edge of your vision feels wrong, you might already be too close. The Bellwether family lived in Hemwick Parish, Massachusetts, a town you won't find on modern maps. It's gone, officially erased, the highways rerouted, the woods sealed as conservation land. But before 1912, it was just another rural parish, home to farmers, mill workers, and stonecutters. Ordinary people, except for one family whose name meant more than bloodlines or local standing. Bellwether, the guiding sheep, the one the rest are meant to follow. Do you understand what that implies? Their name was not an accident. Families like that don't appear in history books without purpose. They are chosen, and chosen bloodlines rarely get to decide their own fate. The father, Elias Bellwether, worked stone like a priest works scripture. He didn't carve gravestones. He built thresholds, gates, lintels, door frames that were spoken of as too precise, too aligned, as if they'd been measured not by hand but by something else. His wife, Lydia, was a woman of refinement. Once employed in Boston, she left under circumstances the records do not describe. Only a faint rumor that her last household stopped using métis. Hours after she departed. Their children, Margaret and Ellis, were pale, polite, unsettlingly quiet. Before 1912 they were respected, even admired. After 1912 they were feared, because in the spring of that year, something impossible began to happen. The Bellwethers stopped casting shadows. Think about that for a moment. You've lived your entire life in the certainty that when light strikes your body, the darkness follows. It's proof you exist, proof you're real. When the Bellwethers walked, nothing stretched behind them, no extension on the ground, no silhouette in the lamplight. They moved like bodies cut loose from reality, as if light itself refused to acknowledge them. The first man who saw it, a farmhand named Red Tuller, told the Reverend that when young Ellis walked along the orchard road at dusk, the fog and the trees all cast long shadows, but the boy had none. None. He said his stomach dropped, like his body knew before his mind could catch up that what he was seeing should not exist. And Red Tuller wasn't the only one. Within weeks, others reported the same of Margaret, of Lydia, of Elias. A whole family walking through the village like ghosts with weight, visible, solid, yet severed from the laws of light. The town fell into silence. Not outrage, not witch hunts. Silence. That's the difference between superstition and terror. When something is merely strange, people gossip. But when something is wrong, when it cuts too close to the structure of reality itself, people stop speaking because words themselves feel dangerous. And then the man from Boston came, no name, just an overcoat too clean for the mud roads and boots that had not known a farm. He carried a seal no one recognized, but the Reverend opened his door anyway. The stranger asked one question: where is the family with no shadows? Understand the gravity here. No newspaper had reported it, no traveler had carried the tale beyond Hemwick, and yet someone in Boston already knew, which means this wasn't discovery, this was surveillance. The Bellwethers had been watched, and when their shadows vanished, the watchers sent for them. The man stood before the nailed-shut house at the edge of the woods. Neighbors peered through curtains. He knocked twice. No answer. He lit a cigarette and said aloud, "They're not inside, but something is." From that moment, Hemwick Parish was cursed. Animals miscarried, crops soured, children began biting their tongues bloody to avoid speaking the Bellwether name. And in the backyard, Margaret began to dig. Not wide, like a grave. Deep, like a tunnel. The priest who saw it swore the roots of the trees had curled away from the soil as if the earth itself feared what was being unearthed. And in the dark he saw movement, something pale, something breathing. When confronted, Margaret said only this: "We're digging our shadows out." Do you understand? They hadn't lost their shadows, they'd buried them. Or worse, something had taken them, and they were trying to bring it back. But what came back was not theirs. This is not folklore, not campfire horror. The files exist, the journals exist, and once we unseal them here, you will see what those in power tried to erase. Because the Bellwether family was not destroyed, they evolved, their bloodline remains, and some of them walk the earth today, shadowless still. Before you dismiss this, turn your head, look at the ground, look in the mirror, ask yourself, does it still follow, or has it already begun to thin? When the Reverend returned from the Bellwether yard that spring night, he wasn't the same. Parishioners described him as pale, stammering, his hands trembling as if frostbitten, though no cold touched the air. For 3 days he locked himself in the chapel, ringing no bells, preaching no sermons. By the 4th, he was gone. Took a carriage south and never came back. That should have been the first warning. Even men of God, whose entire trade rests on faith in unseen powers, could not stand before whatever lived beneath that house. But Hemwick ignored it. They thought they could carry on. You'll learn quickly in this story. People always think silence equals safety. They think ignoring the forbidden keeps it at bay. But silence is a gate, and once opened, it never shuts. The Bellwether children dug deeper each day. Witnesses spoke of their small hands tearing soil as if it were paper. Sometimes Ellis joined Margaret. Sometimes he stood at the edge of the hole, humming, not singing, humming, a low resonance that neighbors swore made their windows quiver, the sound of something testing the air between worlds. And when Margaret finally spoke of their purpose, "We're digging our shadows out," the truth no one wanted to face became unavoidable. Shadows are not absence. Shadows are presence. They belong to something larger than us, and the Bellwethers had touched it. The doctor of the town, a man of science, dismissed it as mass hysteria. He thought the townsfolk were superstitious fools, so he brought rope and a lantern to the hole. He lowered the light into the black, watched it vanish after 12 feet, extinguished like water swallowing flame. He tried again, lowering deeper, then the rope snapped, not frayed, not burned, snapped clean, as if something inside had bitten it. He staggered back, white as ash, muttering words no doctor of science should ever speak. That wasn't a hole, that was a throat. By morning the hole was gone, perfectly covered, smooth earth like nothing had ever been dug. No rope, no lantern, no Margaret. Only barefoot prints in the mud, leading not toward the village, but back to the Bellwether cellar door. The message was clear. Once you open a throat, it does not close, it swallows. And yet the family walked through town the next day, pale, quiet, buying flour, buying wax. No one dared stop them. But when Lydia leaned toward the brass scale on the counter, something even worse was seen. Her reflection was missing, not broken, not distorted, simply absent. The shelves behind her appeared, the oil lamp behind her burned, but Lydia herself, gone from the mirror. And the same for Ellis, for Margaret, for Elias. No shadows, no reflections, no evidence light acknowledged them at all. They were becoming untethered from reality, their bodies severed from the laws of physics. And here is where the story shifts from folklore to something deeper, something systemic. Because if a family can exist without shadow or reflection, what are they? What force protects them? What ancient agreement are they bound to? You've been told all your life that reality is fixed, that light bends, that shadows form, that reflections mirror. But that is conditioning, a control system. The Bellwethers were not the first to escape it. They were simply the first to be seen. Every culture whispers about them, the unreflected, the shadowless, the hollowed. In Egypt, they were called the carless. In Babylon, they were named the mirrorless. In medieval Europe, they were whispered of as changelings. Always the same archetype, always erased once discovered. The man from Boston, the one with the unknown seal, understood this. He wasn't there to witness. He was there to contain. That's why no reports surfaced in official papers, why Hemwick Parish itself was erased from maps, dissolved into a state forest. Because once a family escapes the prison of reflection, they are no longer citizens, they are no longer subjects of law, they become ungovernable. That's why you've never heard this story until now, Because it isn't just horror, it's rebellion. Think about it. What is a shadow but proof you are tethered? What is a reflection but proof you are still trapped in the prison of light? A shadow is not you, it's your leash, and the Bellwethers cut theirs. That's why governments were afraid. That's why the church fled. That's why academics erased them from history. Not because they were cursed, but because they had escaped the system. By the summer of 1912, disappearances had begun. First animals, then people. The widow, Clara Vint, who had watched Margaret dig day after day, vanished. Her house left empty, her sewing unfinished, the needle still threaded on the chair. No struggle, no body, just gone. And every time someone disappeared, the Bellwethers seemed so tronja, as though absence itself was feeding them. Now ask yourself this. When you stand in front of a mirror, do you see yourself, or do you see the prison keeping you here? And if one day your reflection refused to return, would you panic? Or would you finally be free? The Bellwether family's condition spread like a fever through Hemwick Parish. Not because it touched the bodies of the townsfolk, but because it gnawed at their sanity. Imagine walking home in twilight, hearing footsteps behind you, turning, and realizing it is only yourself. And yet your shadow lags behind, twitching, delayed. That is what they reported. Shadows that behaved, strangely, refusing to obey their owners. Children's reflections in the glass that blinked twice when the child had not blinked at all. Mirrors that refused to return the truth. The entire town was unraveling, not because the Bellwethers harmed them, but because the idea of the Bellwethers, untethered, unbound, contaminated reality like rot beneath wallpaper. And then, the man from Boston returned. He never gave a name. No record exists of him in census or church logs, though everyone remembered the overcoat, the seal on the folded parchment, and the cigarette smoke curling like ink in water. They remembered, too, that he was unafraid to stand at the Bellwether threshold. That is how you know he was not ordinary, because ordinary men do not stand at the door of the unreflected without trembling. He called a meeting in the chapel, as if he had authority, and the town obeyed. The doctor, the postman, the farmers, the widows, they all gathered, though none of them could explain why they felt compelled to sit and listen. Compulsion itself was his authority, and this is where the forbidden truth begins to bleed through. The man did not ask questions about shadows. He did not ask about mirrors. He asked about lineage. He asked about bloodlines. Who married into the Bellwethers? He demanded. Whose daughters, whose sons, whose veins run parallel to theirs? Do you understand? This was not an investigation. It was a harvest. He was not there to destroy the Bellwethers. He was there to track them, to contain their spread, to ensure the condition did not slip loose into other families. This was culling disguised as inquiry. The Reverend resisted at first. "This is not your parish," he said. But the man from Boston laid the seal on the pulpit. Witnesses described it as a half-circle cut through by a vertical line, the same symbol later discovered scorched into the Bellwether ruins. The moment it touched the odd, the entire room fell silent. Babies stopped crying. Dogs stopped barking outside. The parishioners felt a pressure in their teeth as if the air itself had been given weight. The Reverend sat down. He never spoke again that night. The man explained nothing. He only wrote names. Families connected to the Bellwethers by marriage, by land purchase, by whispered rumor. Names that should have been forgotten. He collected them like debts. And here's the piece that was never meant to surface. This wasn't the first time. This wasn't even the first family. Documents hidden in Yale's Baynecker Library, by which I have seen, speak of entire bloodlines erased from record for the same affliction. Always the same language. Shadowless, mirrorless, unanchored. Always the same outcome. Towns vanished, records burned, names rewritten. The Bellwethers were just one thread in a web centuries old. The Boston man left the chapel that night with a folded list of names, tucked it into his coat, and said a phrase the townsfolk never forgot. "Light remembers what you try to hide." Then he disappeared into the woods. No carriage, no horse, just gone. After that, everything accelerated. Hemwick Parish fell into a kind of living nightmare. Chickens laid eggs with no yolks, milk curdled in the pail, wells tasted of iron, and worse, people began to vanish. Not by violence, not by break-ins, they were simply missing as though their bodies had been erased like chalk on slate. First Clara Vint, then a farmhand, then a boy named Joseph Denton who swore the Bellwether children had invited him to hear the sound under the dirt. His parents found his boots at the edge of the orchard, that was all. Each disappearance frayed the town further. By July, no one walked at night. By August, no one lit candles after dark, because flames bent strangely in Hemwick. They leaned toward the Bellwether house, as if pulled by some breathless gravity. And inside the Bellwether home, neighbors reported seeing faint flickers in the nailed-shut windows, like movements against the glass. Not people, shapes. But here's what matters. The Bellwethers still shopped at the general store, still collected mail, still lived among the townsfolk. They did not flee. They did not hide. And that is the most terrifying truth of all. Because the family knew something the rest did not. Once you are untethered from shadow and reflection, nothing can harm you. Not the town, not the church, not the government. This is why the Boston man came, not to kill them, but to watch them, to record, to measure how long a family could live unreflected before something worse emerged. And that something did emerge. It came from the cellar. By September, townsfolk said the earth beneath the Bellwether home was humming. Not voices, not words. A tone, low, endless, vibrating through soil and stone like the bowing of a giant string. And the children, Margaret and Ellis, were heard humming back. One neighbor swore she saw the cellar door swing open, though no one's. He had touched it. And standing there were the children, mouths open, humming in harmony. But the sound didn't come from their throats. It came from behind them, from the black. The neighbor's son Curtis saw it too. He told his mother the next morning that the children's shadows were not gone. They were standing inside the cellar, waiting. And when the children opened their mouths, the shadows moved as if trying to step through. Curtis never spoke again. By winter, he had been committed to an asylum in Boston. His file was sealed. This is where the story becomes something else entirely. It is no longer about a single family. It is about the gates between worlds, the doors Elias Bellwether built with his stonemason's precision. Because what if shadows are not ours? What if shadows are not absence, but presence? And what if they are only borrowed, leashed to us, until something stronger takes them back? The Bellwethers were not victims. They were chosen. And the world was never the same after they opened the cellar. By October, Hemwick Parish was a skeleton of itself. Crops failed. Families packed wagons and left in the night. The post road was silent, shutters nailed tight, doors barred. Yet the Bellwethers remained, calm, unbothered, walking the main street as though none of this touched them. That was the final straw. On the morning of October 12th, a group of men met outside the chapel. They carried kerosene, pitchforks, and rifles. Old-world weapons for something they didn't understand. Their plan was simple: burn the Bellwether home to ash. Whatever lived inside, whatever spoke from the cellar, would be buried under fire and ruin. But the town made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the children. When the mob arrived at the Bellwether house, the family was waiting. Elias Bellwether stood on the porch, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak, but the children did. Margaret, barely 12, looked at the crowd and said, "Your shadows don't belong to you anymore." At first, no one moved. Then one of the men lifted his rifle, aimed at Elias, and fired. Witnesses later swore the bullet passed through him, not like flesh yielding, but like Elias was a projection, a film on air. The bull, it tore through the doorframe. Elias did not flinch. Then Ellis, the boy, stepped forward. He raised his hand, palm open, and one by one torches went dark. Not blown out, smothered, as though light itself had been inhaled. Darkness crawled over the mob. That's when the screaming started. The townsfolk dropped their weapons, clawing at the dirt, at themselves, at the air, because their shadows had risen. Not from the firelight, from the ground. Shapes of themselves, taller, wrong, with elongated limbs, tugging upward like marionettes. One farmer's shadow wrenched free of his feet and stood grinning, though the farmer himself had no strength to smile. Another man's reflection appeared in the Bellwether windows, though he was still outside. His reflection turned, winked, and vanished. Moments later, the man collapsed, lifeless, his face pale as wax. The mob broke instantly. Half fled into the woods, half fell writhing in the mud, their bodies flickering in and out of alignment with the lantern light. Elias Bellwether spoke at last. His voice was low, steady, but it carried like a sermon. "Do not mistake this for a curse. This is the debt of light, paid at last." The mob scattered. No one ever tried to burn the Bellwether house again. But here's the strangest part. The town records show that after that night, no more people vanished. The disappearances stopped. The chaos ended. The Bellwethers kept to themselves and the parish grew silent, dead but stable, as though some bargain had been struck. The Reverend's final sermon hinted at it. His words survive in a faded diary. They have what they came for. The rest of us must not look too long at our own shadows, lest we remember they were never ours. After that, he never preached again. By December, Hemwick Parish was abandoned. Travellers who passed through reported doors hanging open, meals left half-eaten, and beds unmade, as if the entire town had walked out mid-step. Yet no bodies were ever found. Only the Bellwether house remained inhabited. Smoke rose from the chimney. Windows glowed at night. But no one ever dared knock again. And here is the most chilling note of all. In 1913, decades later, a surveyor passing through the ruins of Hemwick Parish found a fresh child's footprint in the dust of the chapel floor. Small, barefoot, leading not out the door, but into the wall where the pulpit had once stood. The Bellwethers had never left. They had only gone deeper. The Bellwether incident should have ended in fire and ruin. That's what happened to most families accused of the unnatural in 19th century New England. Torches, ropes, flames. But not here. Why? Because someone wanted them alive. The Boston man, the one with the parchment seal, was seen again in 1876, years after Hemwick Parish was abandoned. He appeared not in Massachusetts, but in Maine, overseeing a team of men dismantling an old mill near the South's Kennebec River. The mill's basement contained something no lumber records ever mentioned. A stone arch built into the foundation, inscribed with the same half-circle symbol scorched into the Bellwether ruins. This man was not a preacher, not a government official. He was something else, a collector. His journals, smuggled out of a private archive in 1954, reveal his real task. He was part of what he called the Concordat of Astor, a loose, secret network dedicated not to erasing the shadowless families, but to monitoring them, studying them, cataloguing them. The Bellwethers weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. The Concordat's files listed over a dozen names scattered across centuries. The Ardens of Providence, 1791, a family whose reflections aged faster than their bodies. The Hollisters of Vermont, 1824, who cast double shadows that moved against each other. The Sutter Child of Pennsylvania, 1839, born with no reflection at all. And of course the Bellwethers of Hemwick Parish, 1872. In every case, the Concordat's role was the same. Do not destroy, do not expose, but contain. Quiet the towns, erase the records, move the families deeper into obscurity. The goal was not safety, it was observation. The Boston man wrote one chilling line about Hemwick. Their cellar hum is the same frequency as Kennebec. We must determine whether resonance is local or universal. If universal, containment will fail. What was he describing? The hum beneath the Bellwether house, the vibration in the ground. To the Concordat, this wasn't haunting. It was resonance, like a tuning fork struck beneath the soil of America. The Bellwethers weren't cursed, they were aligned. And the cellar? The cellar was not just a basement, it was an aperture. The journals describe shadow families as not incomplete but surplus. That's the most disturbing revelation. Their shadows were not missing. They had more than one. They carried echoes, extra imprints, and when those imprints grew strong enough, they demanded to be released. The children weren't losing their shadows, they were splitting. The Boston man catalogued every sighting, every disappearance. He noted that when people vanished in Hemwick Parish, their shadows did not vanish with them. The shadows remained moving, lingering, which means, and this is critical, the Bellwethers were not erasing people, they were absorbing them. By 1880, the Concordat declared the Bellwethers stable, no further action, which is stranger still, because by then, Hemwick Parish was a ghost town, the land worthless, the family isolated in ruins. Stable? Stable to whom? There's a final note in the Boston Man's Journal, dated 1884. Margaret has learned to call them by name. Ellis listens but does not speak. Elias insists the debt is fulfilled. I disagree. Light has memory. Memory will collect. No further records exist. The man himself vanishes from all archives. His handwriting never appears again. But here's what we do know. The Bellwethers endured. Census fragments from 1900 show 3 occupants still living in the old Hemwick house. Then the trail goes cold, until 1932 when a physician in Boston noted a peculiar case. A woman admitted for surgery who cast no reflection in the operating lamps. Her name listed only once. Margaret B., the Bellwether. Daughter. Alive. Still unreflected. Still humming. And here's the revelation that shatters everything. The Concordat didn't just observe, they bred. They married shadowless bloodlines into chosen families, seeding the condition across generations. Which means, if the Bellwethers survived into the 20th century, they didn't vanish. They multiplied. By 1900, Hemwick Parish was a forgotten ghost town. Its name appeared only in land deeds, its roads left off new maps, but the Bellwethers had not disappeared. They had simply migrated. The first clue comes from Margaret Bellwether, the daughter who once told a mob that their shadows no longer belonged to them. Decades later, she resurfaces in a place that seems too perfect to be coincidence, the Danvers State Hospital, Massachusetts. In 1932, Dr. Howard Wilkins, a surgeon at Danvers, recorded an anomalous observation during a routine gallbladder operation. The patient, a pale woman in her 70s, cast no reflection in the angled surgical lamps. None of the metal instruments reflected her image either. Wilkins initially assumed it was a trick of light. Then he saw it again, and again. The patient's intake record lists her as Margaret B. No family, no visitors. Yet her medical file contains a curious note, scrawled in pencil. Voice resonance in observation ward induces sympathetic vibration in steel rails beneath foundation. Someone had noticed it. The hum again. Beneath the asylum, just like beneath the Bellwether cellar. Margaret died 2 weeks later during recovery, but her body, it was never released to next of kin, nor buried in the Danvers cemetery. Hospital ledgers list it as relocated to Concord. That word again, Concordat. And Margaret was not the only one. Between 1910 and 1950, state hospitals across New England reported cases of patients with shadow anomalies. Vermont State Hospital, 1911, a mute boy whose shadow gestured when he did not. Worcester State Asylum, 1927, a woman whose reflection in windows smiled seconds after she did. Danvers State Hospital, 1939, an entire ward reported waking up to find their shadows missing, replaced by others. Each incident was swiftly suppressed, files redacted, staff reassigned, but the pattern is unmistakable. The Bellwether condition had not died out, it had spread. And the Concordat? They were watching. In 1942, the US government quietly partnered with private institutions to absorb unclassified asylum cases. The justification was national security during wartime, but the timing is revealing. Buried inside an OSS memorandum is a single sentence. Subjects of the Concordat lineages are not to be transferred overseas. Keep them under North American soil. Which raises the question, were the Bellwethers and families like them not just a curse, but a resource? Because if you believe the scattered testimonies, the shadowless could do more than unsettle. They could erase. There are rumors, almost too wild to repeat, of OSS field tests during Bellwether, where certain detainees simply ceased to exist after being placed in contact with shadowless patients. Their names vanished from rolls. Their reflections never reappeared in mirrors, as though history itself had spat them out. Margaret's death in 1932 was not an end. It was a transfer. Her bloodline, carefully monitored, folded into records that vanish conveniently after the 1950s. but asylum corridors and psychiatric wards are littered with hints of her descendants. Patients who would hum low tones at night, causing the building itself to tremble. Children who appeared in census reports under state custody, but cast no image in photographs. By the mid-20th century, the Bellwethers were no longer confined to a ruined parish in Massachusetts. They had become a hidden thread in the very fabric of American institutions, and if the Concordat's records are to be believed, they weren't just surviving, they were multiplying. By the 1940s, America's state hospitals were filled with what officials called unclassifiable cases. Behind closed doors, doctors whispered about patients who could not be explained by medicine, who frightened even the most hardened staff. One case stands out above all others. Ward C of Danvers State Hospital, 1946. Official records say Ward C was temporarily closed for sanitation after a structural collapse. But hidden testimonies, unearthed decades later, suggest something much stranger. The story comes from a night nurse named Clara Winslow, who gave a sworn deposition in 1952 before vanishing herself. She described how, on March 14, 1946, she was stationed on Ward C, which held special observation patients, those who displayed the Bellwether symptoms. At exactly 2:13 a.m., Clara said the entire ward began to vibrate. The iron bed frame shuddered, the light bulbs flickered, and a deep hum pulsed through the walls. Patients began chanting, not words, but low tones, layered and harmonic, as though they had practiced together. Though Clara swore they had never spoken before, then something impossible happened. Clara claimed the patients' shadows detached. One by one they peeled themselves off the walls, stretching, lengthening, becoming fluid. Some darted across the ceiling. Some merged into shapes she could not describe, shapes that did not obey human geometry. Clara ran. She grabbed another nurse, and together they returned minutes later with an orderly. But the ward was empty, not just of patients, of everything. The beds were gone, the chairs, the trays, the files, even the dust that should have coated the floor. Every material trace of Ward C had vanished. And most disturbing of all, the ward itself was smaller. A section of the hospital brick and mortar had simply ceased to exist. The blueprints no longer matched the building. The administration silenced Clara. Her testimony was filed, sealed, then buried. On paper, Ward C was written off as condemned and sealed with brick, but underground whispers told a different story. Ward C was taken. By who or what? No one dared say. The Concordat, however, knew exactly what had happened. In a surviving fragment of OSS correspondence from 1947, an agent noted, "The Bellwether resonance has reached terminal phase. Containment impossible in groups exceeding 12. Do not assemble subjects in proximity. Repeat, do not assemble." The conclusion was clear. When too many shadow bearers gathered, the hum amplified, creating not just dissonance, but an opening. The Bellwethers and those like them weren't anomalies. They were doorways. Ward C was not destroyed. Ward C was relocated. To where, the files do not say. But Clara Winslow's final letter to her sister, smuggled out before her disappearance, ends with a single line. "They're building another parish, but not in this world." After the vanishing of Ward C in 1946, the US government could no longer deny what it was dealing with. Whatever force the Bellwethers carried, it wasn't madness or superstition or folklore. It was power. And in the early days of the Cold War, power meant one thing: weaponization. By 1949, the newly formed CIA inherited fragments of the OSS's Concordat program. Buried under the innocuous name Project Symphony, the files describe a chilling new directive. Harness resonance phenomena for operational advantage. Subjects of lineage to be retained indefinitely. Considered assets of national security. This was no longer about curing patients or hiding scandals. This was about using the Bellwether anomaly as a tool against enemies. The Soviet parallel. The US was not alone. Soviet archives, opened briefly after the fall of the USSR, revealed their own version, Project Koshai. Russian scientists captured reports of entire villages near Kursk, where shadow fractures appeared in the 1930s. Survivors described relatives who spoke in harmonics, who disappeared during communal prayer, leaving only outlines scorched into church walls. By the 1950s, both superpowers were quietly experimenting with shadow bearers. The Soviets built chambers lined with polished steel, amplifying the humming resonance. The CIA built underground bunkers in Nevada, known as chambers of silence, where patients were forced to sing until the walls themselves seemed to bend, and in both countries the results were catastrophic. The experiments' declassified scraps hint at erasure tests. Detainees were placed into rooms with Bellwether descendants. Some never walked out, not because they were killed, but because every record of their existence disappeared. Files went blank, birth certificates faded, photographs developed without their faces. In one report from 1957, an Air Force officer wrote, "Subject's mother does not recognize his name. Wife insists she never married. House is vacant, but we can still hear him walking inside." It was as though the Bellwethers could edit reality its turn. Elf, but only in localized bursts, always linked to resonance, to the hum, the vanishing bass. One of the darkest legends of this period is the alleged disappearance of a military site in New Mexico, 1961. Locals swore they saw the base one day, fences, watchtowers, radar dishes, and the next the desert was flat with no trace it had ever been there. No records exist. But one haunting memo survives from Project Symphony's lead researcher. Do not cluster more than a dozen. Do not let them sing in unison. A parish rebuilt is a door opened. The phrase parish rebuilt is a direct callback to the Bellwethers' origins in Hemwick Parish. The Concordat knew, gathering too many shadow bearers risked tearing open whatever place Ward C had gone. But here's the twist. By the 1970s, both US and Soviet programs abruptly shut down. Officially, they were ineffective. Unofficially, entire facilities and staff simply disappeared, just like Ward C. Some say the Bellwethers turned their gift inward, erasing their captors. Others whisper that both governments struck an unspoken pact, never again assemble too many of them in one place. And yet sightings continued. A foster child in Ohio who appeared in no yearbooks, a prisoner in Louisiana who cast 3 shadows, not one. A woman in Chernobyl who walked into the core and never came out, but whose humming can still be heard on Geiger recordings. The Bellwether line had spread across the globe, and the Cold War wasn't about missiles alone. It was about which side could control the parish that was no longer here. By the late 1970s, Project Symphony had gone dark. Project Koshai had been buried in sealed Soviet vaults. Officially, the Bellwether resonance no longer existed, but families knew better. Across America and beyond, strange stories began to surface, not in classified documents but in whispered legends, community gossip, and family secrets that only came out after too many drinks or too many funerals. The children who don't appear. In 1983, a man in Ohio sued his local school district, insisting his daughter had been enrolled for 3 years but was nowhere in the records. Teachers vaguely remembered her, a quiet girl with a low, droning voice, but no yearbooks, no attendance sheets, no photographs showed her face. The judge dismissed the case as a clerical error, but neighbors reported something more unsettling. When the girl spoke, the windows rattled. The family moved a year later. No forwarding address. The 3 shadows. In rural Louisiana, inmates swore that one prisoner, a lanky man called Earl J., had not 1 but 3 shadows. Guards dismissed it as a trick of the lights. Until one night during a prison riot, Earl began humming. The fluorescent bulbs shattered. The prison's south wing lost power. When the lights came back, the guards counted every inmate. All were present, except for Earl. His file is still in the Louisiana Department of Corrections database, but the name is grayed out, unclickable, like a hyperlink to nowhere. The woman in Chernobyl. After the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, cleanup workers spoke of a woman seen walking straight into the burning reactor core. Her clothes never ignited. Her steps echoed as though she were walking through a church nave. No record of her exists in Soviet logs, but one engineer, who smuggled out tapes of the Geiger counter readings, insists her humming is still audible on the playback, a droning resonance buried beneath the static. When Western scientists and towers analyzed the tape decades later, they noticed something eerie. The hum was not random. It was harmonic, layered, as if multiple voices were singing at once. The DNA problem. In recent years, amateur genealogists digging through DNA databases claim to have stumbled on anomalies, family trees that refuse to complete, matches that vanish after being uploaded, branches that show no data available where relatives should be. One haunting Reddit thread, later deleted, contained a post from a user who said, "Every time I upload my family data, my maternal grandfather's side just disappears, as though the software refuses to build that branch. My mother doesn't cast a shadow when she's tired. I've seen it with my own eyes." The account was removed within 24 hours, the parish that follows. What all these stories have in common is the sense of something larger, a gathering, an unseen parish that continues to grow even after Hemwick was erased. If the Concordate's warnings were true, every shadow bearer is more than just an individual anomaly. Each one is a note in a larger chord, and if too many come together, they don't just hum, they open the door. An anonymous Air Force whistleblower described a desert compound outside Tonopah, Nevada, known among staff as the Chapel. It was built as an acoustic testing chamber. Massive concrete halls designed to contain harmonic resonance. Inside, they assembled 13 Bellwether descendants, each sourced through foster systems and mental institutions. The plan was to force them to hum in unison and measure what happened. At 3:06 a.m. on June 12, 1972, the compound went silent. Radar pings from the site stopped. A convoy sent hours later reported nothing but desert scrub. The base itself was gone. But for weeks afterward, pilots flying over the region swore they saw flickers, a shadow of buildings where nothing stood, like mirages etched in concrete. The project was immediately sealed. Official records state the base was never built. Deep in Soviet Ukraine, a psychiatric wing in Dnipropetrovsk was retrofitted with soundproof chambers. Soviet scientists attempted to weaponize the resonance by aligning it with low-frequency radio waves. Declassified notes from the 1990s contain chilling language. Phase 2 complete. Subjects responding with group tonal synchronization. Walls vibrate. Photographic equipment fails. Unexplained erasures in personnel files. 3 staff unaccounted, though badges remain, will continue despite loss. By 1986, the same year as the Chernobyl meltdown, the entire hospital complex was abandoned overnight. Officially, it was blamed on structural failure. But photographs taken by urban explorers decades later show corridors warped, doors bent into arcs, as though the building itself had been pulled inward. Some swear if you stand inside the ruins today, you can still hear humming in the walls. The last known reference to the Bellwether anomaly appears in a strange incident during the collapse of the USSR. A joint US-Soviet listening post in Alaska, set up to monitor submarine signals, began intercepting something else. Not Morse code, not sonar, but a chorus. The recordings describe low harmonic chanting, matching frequencies noted in both Project Symphony and Koshai. The sound was traced not to the ocean but inland, to a snow-covered research station staffed by 11 personnel. When a helicopter team arrived days later, the station was gone. No wreckage, no tracks, only smooth ice as if nothing had ever stood there. The tapes remain classified, but one technician who smuggled out a copy claims that when you play them backward, the voices form words. Not Russian, not English, but Latin. One phrase repeats, Ecclesia renovata est. The parish has been rebuilt. Across 3 decades, 3 continents and 3 governments, the result was the same. Wherever too many Bellwether descendants were gathered, reality fractured. Not explosively, not violently, but surgically. The entire location lifted away, leaving behind only silence, only absence. The Concordate's warning had been right all along. Do not assemble. Do not let them sing. Do not rebuild the parish. And yet, time after time, someone tried. And time after time, whole facilities vanished into the same nameless void that swallowed Ward C. But here's the question. If these disappearances were not destruction, but relocation, then where did all those people, those buildings, those lives go? If Hemwick Parish was the first, then by the 1990s, how many more parishes had already been built? Not everyone who vanished stayed gone. Across decades, scattered testimonies emerged from people who claimed to have returned or been returned from these erased facilities. Their stories were fragmented, contradictory, but one detail surfaced again and again. They all spoke of a parish that shouldn't exist. In 1994, police in Oregon picked up a man wandering barefoot along Highway 26. He was sunburned, dazed, and muttering about the chapel in the sand. He carried no ID. His fingerprints didn't match any database. But what unsettled investigators most was his medical condition. His blood vibrated at a measurable frequency when drawn, producing faint harmonics on the monitoring equipment. When asked where he had come from, he said only, "The parish has many doors. Some stay shut, some open both ways." 2 days later, he vanished from his holding cell without a trace. The door had never been unlocked. In 1997, a 14-year-old girl appeared at a bus station in Minsk, Belarus. Witnesses said she stepped out of thin air. Her clothes were decades out of fashion, and she spoke in a rural dialect almost extinct since the 1930s. When asked her name, she gave the surname Hemwick. Medical scans revealed something stranger. Her vocal cords were double-layered, capable of producing 2 notes simultaneously. She was taken into custody by Belarusian authorities. No public record of her exists after that day. Whether in Oregon, Minsk, or small-town reports buried in local papers, the stories all pointed to one truth. The parish never died. It had only scattered. Its children were finding their way back, and every time they gathered, in 3s, in 7s, in dozens, the resonance deepened. Each survivor hinted at the same final event, a return, a rejoining, a choir that would not be stopped. The internet changed everything. By the late 2000s, rumors of the Bellwether resonance spread through conspiracy forums, ARG communities, and hidden darknet boards. Most laughed it off, creepypasta, urban legend, but some threads vanished as quickly as they appeared. Entire forums scrubbed, archives erased, and yet fragments survived. Clips of audio recordings where low hums warped the mic. Blurred photographs of gatherings where faces stretched like echoes. Strange genealogy reports of families that doubled back on themselves, branches folding inward. One recurring phrase appears in leaked Discord chats and encrypted forums. When they sing, the parish returns. On October the 12th, 2019, hundreds of amateur radio operators reported intercepting a mysterious broadcast on shortwave bands. It lasted 14 minutes. A droning chorus, layered and rising. In the final seconds, a woman's voice whispered in Latin, "Ecclesia completa est." The parish is complete. Within 48 hours, 3 separate rural towns, one in Montana, one in rural Siberia, and one in northern Finland, reported blackouts, missing persons, and buildings that seemed to fold away in front of witnesses. No official explanation was ever given. If the Concordate's prophecy was true, then the Bellwether parish was never a place. It was a pattern, a resonance that echoes through bloodlines, through shadows, through time itself. And once enough voices hum together, reality itself bends to listen. So maybe the true mystery isn't what happened to Hemwick in 1903, or to the vanished facilities in Nevada, Ukraine, Alaska, or even to the survivors who slipped back. The question is simpler and far more terrifying. When the parish sings again, will you hear it?